Hey, Casey, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Nice to see you and meet you and be here with you.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're here. Can you just tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am Casey, and I am the founder of At Peace Parents, which is a business that provides coaching and educational services to parents who are parenting pathologically demand avoidant children and teens, so ages 3 to 17. My previous life and career pre my PDA son's nervous system burnout was as a researcher and a social scientist, um, working in Washington, D.C., and I have a doctorate in political science. So it's all coming for full circle as I start to do some empirical research with a university here in Michigan on pathological demand avoidance. But I bring my training with the scientific process and measuring data to helping parents and accommodate their PDA children and measure progress so that they can actually know if the strategies are working with their own two eyes.
That's so cool. I mentioned to you before we started taping that I watched your free masterclass yesterday, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes because it was really super valuable for me, and I think it will be for lots of parents. But both your warmth and care and compassion as a mother comes through, along with your clear academic training that you have as an academic. So it's a great. You're really well suited for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, my dorky side doesn't hide.
That's all right. We need that.
It
We need
comes
that.
out.
So, do you mind sharing just a little bit about? Well, first, before I'm going to ask you more details about what exactly PDA is, but for somebody who's listening who has no idea what PDA is, can you just give us like the real short definition of PDA, and then a little bit later in our interview, I'll ask you for more of a detailed definition of the characteristics of PDA.
Yeah. So I think the most elegant and what I find to be the most comprehensive definition of PDA is a nervous system disability that is defined by a survival drive for autonomy and equality that consistently overrides other survival instincts like toileting, eating, sleeping, hygiene, and safety, either in the moment or over time as nervous system activation accumulates. So while many children, like my younger son, who's not PDA, have a strong drive for autonomy or equality, and many neurodivergent children do as well, it doesn't necessarily consistently override their other survival instincts, which is a subconscious process and very similar to a trauma response.
Okay, that's great. And it
Fight, flight,
often,
freeze.
and I
Yeah.
know that the jury is still out on this, but it's often seen as a profile of autism. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. I would categorize it as a sub profile of autism. But I am not a clinician, so I don't weigh in on, how we're defining things
Okay. Yeah,
unless there's
I guess I say
research.
that jury's still out because I know some people are saying that it's possible that it can exist in people who are not autistic. I've heard
Yeah.
I heard you say that. I've heard other people say that. So the research is still ongoing.
So I think rather than me saying, yes, it can exist without autism, what I've heard from people who identify as PDA, some of them do not also identify as autistic. So that's through the identity model, not the clinical or diagnostic model. And then because the work I do with parents is really about like their agency and decision making, if they don't think their child is autistic but PDA, I'm never going to argue with them
Right.
about that, right? It's
Okay.
like what matters is what helps the child.
Okay.
So,
Great. So
yeah.
do you mind sharing a little bit of your story of how you came to find out that your son was PDA?
Sure. So my son, Cooper, went into nervous system burnout, which I had no idea what that was at the time, around the age of 4.5. What it looked like was an autistic regression or him sort of turning into a feral animal, like cowering in corners, screaming, not talking. He stopped walking. He stopped eating. But it sort of was precipitated by my second son's birth. He was around 4 at that time, and things had been escalating where when he wouldn't eat, for example, I would apply more traditional strategies or behavioral approaches like 1, 2, 3 magic or positive discipline with consequences, and just be like, well, you can't have dessert if you don't eat. And increasingly, and I even would put him in timeouts and stuff, and he would increasingly go into fight flight dramatically, and shut down where he wouldn't eat. And it just increased and increased. And at a certain point, I looked back also on our experience as parents up to his fourth year, which was just like, if I put it in colloquial terms, it was just like, how is everyone else able to parent? And like, we're basically barely alive here, because he needed constant one-on-one attention. He wouldn't engage in anything independently. I remember my boss at work in Washington, D.C., talking to me about having a 3-year-old or a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old. And he would say, kids are like sponges. Isn't it amazing to watch them learn all of these things and just soak it up? And I remember thinking, like, that's not what's happening. Like, I can't teach my son things. I can't, nothing seems to be getting in, right? But at first I thought it was defiance and a behavioral problem. But when it started to impact the basic needs and he was actually acting like a feral animal, and I would have to grab my newborn and run out into the street while my husband stayed behind so we weren't in the line of fire. I had an aha moment actually on Father's Day 2019, and I was in a yoga class. I went to yoga on my husband's day because I was like, I can't deal. And I was weeping in the yoga class, and I was just like, there's something that's not okay here. And that Monday, I gave my 2 months notice at work and decided to leave my career to, quote, figure it out. I thought it was going to be a temporary thing. We moved to Michigan, and we started to implement sensory strategies and gentle parenting approaches. And some things improved and other things did not. And I came across PDA actually from the occupational therapist my son was working with, because she was working on feeding with him. And he would make this great progress in the sense of he'd add another food, a bridge food, he eats chips, so now let's try one with avocado oil. But then he'd drop the other one, and he'd never expand beyond his couple very controlled foods. And she was like, I haven't seen a pattern like this. This is not how things operate if it's just sensory as a root cause. And so she showed me PDA, and I was like, I can't deal with another acronym right now. And then during the pandemic, I was home with him 24/7, no external influences. He wasn't in school. He wasn't participating in school. No family was around. It was just me. And, at that time I was still trying to move him through the routine of the day. I had a laminated chart. We were signing in, and seeing him fight for his life not to move through the activities, but then he wouldn't want to go outside at the prescribed time, but then he'd really want to go outside when he had a choice. And it just didn't make sense to me through a sensory lens. So my OT again was like, let's look into this pathological demand avoidance profile. And I read the Understanding Pathological Demand Avoidance book. And it was sort of all the light bulbs went off for me. And then I posted in the Tilt Parenting Facebook group, actually about getting a service dog, but also about my son being PDA. And another mom was like, well, I don't know anything about service dogs, but I'm 20 minutes away from you. And I think my daughter has the same profile. And so we met and then sort of had this expanding group of moms. And it was just all the patterns were exactly the same. And I think that was the year that PDA North America had their first conference.
And how many years ago was that you had sort of your realization?
That was 4
years ago.
So
okay.
we moved here 4.5 years ago. but again, like I worked through the sensory and gentle parenting lens for a long time, like 6 months, 8 months before I was like, this still doesn't make
Well, you
sense.
and I were
You know,
talking about that before we started recording, about how you can make all these changes with parenting, and do peaceful parenting and look at the sensory stuff. And I heard you talk about this in the masterclass too, that you kind of um, accommodate sensory stuff, or use the peaceful parenting approach. But if you're still seeing the same challenges, it's usually because there's something else going on.
yeah. Yeah. And it doesn't mean those other strategies aren't amazingly helpful.
No,
It
no,
just
you
means,
don't drop them. You just have to add to it,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It just might not be sufficient
Right. Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
root cause of what
Yeah.
is connected to the behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering if we can talk about maybe briefly, because I know you go into this in a lot of detail in your free masterclass, but if we could briefly talk about the 5 characteristics of PDA, if you wouldn't mind sharing those for people, if they have a better understanding of what it looks like.
Yeah. So the first is the one I mentioned as the definition, which is a survival drive for autonomy and equality that consistently overrides other survival instincts. So, what that means in like real life is when you might see patterns. I'll give a couple anecdotes. Like for safety, like a lot of parents will describe saying, "Oh no, don't go near the river or don't go near the fire," and it's almost like it speeds the child up towards the fire, towards an oncoming car. Like the safety instinct doesn't kick in, right? And so suggestions like, oh, natural consequences aren't helpful because the child will actually accelerate towards the car or the fire or the river, right? And so the fire example is one that I have in my family, but I've worked with hundreds of families, so these are just like very clear examples of when the survival drive for autonomy overrides that safety instinct. But there's also in the moment instances where like encouraging eating can actually make it less likely, right? And there's almost a reflexive shutdown response of like not eating, or encouraging sleep, it decreases the likelihood of sleep. And if we double down on more pressure or even consequences or even gentle encouragement, if there's even the subconscious perception that that's what we want and that there's a loss of autonomy in their subconscious brain, their survival brain, the autonomy will override the survival instinct to eventually sleep when you're tired, right? And so parents often hear, well, they'll eat when they're hungry and they'll sleep when they're tired, but these kids actually don't. And then it can happen in accumulation, which is, I think, the most confusing thing for parents, which is like maybe they'll comply in the moment, right? But the experience of complying, like, okay, fine, I'll eat my food, in their body, they feel the fight flight, experience the fight flight, or freeze. But if it's fight flight, there's nervous system activation, and the activation accumulates, and over time, they might stop eating altogether, or they might have a toileting regression. And this can happen at any age. I'm not just talking about like 3 to 5 year olds. Like I've worked with families who have young adult children who, when nervous system activation accumulates over time from all those perceived losses of autonomy and equality, they start voiding or pooping in the shower because their control is coalescing around a particular basic need. So it's not age specific necessarily. And this is what I believe makes it a nervous system disability, because it disables the individual from accessing what they need to live: eating, safety, hygiene, sleep, or toileting. And what's confusing, and I'm just spending a little bit more time on this first part of the 5 characteristics because this is what I believe defines PDA. What can be confusing from the outside looking in is like 2 PDA kids might look super different. Like my son was very explosive and defiant, and he stopped eating and walking, but his sleep was fine. And it looked like a behavioral problem. Whereas you might have a little girl his age or boy who has a more internalized expression, more shutdown, more selective mutism, not defiant, eating okay, but sleep no longer exists, right? And so that's actually a real anecdote where like a little girl, my son's age, ended up in the ER because she wasn't sleeping and she was completely shut down and it was disabling. But we often look at these symptoms of like they're not eating or they're not sleeping in isolation rather than connected to the nervous system. I'll stop there just in case.
Okay. Well, I just actually had a question that occurred to me when I was watching your masterclass too, when you were talking about this. Would you include, because I think I might include one of those survival instincts as connection along with
Yes.
toileting, eating, safety, sleep, because I think sometimes like oppositionality and tantrums and meltdowns can be like kids. I always say they want to be in connection with us, and so I wonder if that's included in your list too.
So I wouldn't. And here's why. I'm really looking at it through a like neurobiological and physiological lens. And I look to like Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory of like, if there isn't felt safety first, there's no chance for any connection or attachment at all. And that's not to say it's not as important to live. Like I believe that. But I don't think these children are trying to connect through their behavior. I think they're trying to stay alive. And yes, preceding fight, flight, or full shutdown, there is often a social strategy to stay alive. But the type of connection you're talking about, I think personally, this is my perspective, is that it has to be preceded by like what part of the brain they're in. Like they can't connect when they're in the survival brain to anyone. And so when parents are like, you have these amazing parents who are gentle parents who are emotionally attuned, they're doing everything right, there hasn't been a trauma, and they're being told that it's an attachment issue. And maybe it is as an outcome of the neurotype, like preventing the child from being receptive. But if we only look through the attachment lens, we're missing sort of the very foundational level. And that's what I teach about
Right.
is like, this is like, we're working with the subconscious here.
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And the confusing thing too is that like these nervous system activations can happen like when the kid's having fun with their parents or their friends, but they're perceiving a loss of autonomy because they lost the game. So it's this contradiction where you can have the connection, but on a subconscious level, they feel like they're below a game
Right.
that they're playing with you.
Right.
So that's why I distinguish that just for clarity to like help parents and practitioners like parse the root cause. But yes, I do agree with you, Sarah, that connection is a basic need. Yeah. But medical practitioners don't necessarily view it the same as like, they can't eat.
Right. Okay. So for simplicity's sake, you leave it off the list.
Well, just because, I mean, just to be clear, like my motivation is that this is considered a disability because I believe it is, so that parents can get resources, institutional support, you know, not just someone like me who can get a service dog and who can get an au pair from Colombia and can afford to take work off. Like there's so many people who can't do that. And this truly is disabling for the whole family.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, let's go on to the next four, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'll be quicker.
Okay.
I'll be quicker. So the second is equalizing behavior, which is what I call the behavioral expression of the disability. So it's like the first thing I described is what's going on inside them, like fight, flight. But the behavior that we see is often like controlling or defiant, can be rude. I'll I'll give you an example. So when there's a perception of a loss of autonomy, there might be like destruction of things or saying stop talking or growling. One thing that happens is it's often directed at the safest person, which is usually the mom or the lead parent, or the weakest, which is often a sibling. So like it can be obvious, like let's say I tell my son Cooper, like, please stop bothering your brother. Perceived loss of autonomy, perceiving I'm above him on a subconscious level. The equalizing behavior might be he comes into the kitchen where I'm cooking, dumps out all of the spices, or like goes into the kitchen and like knocks a bunch of things on the ground, sort of like to get back to a place of equality or above me. Or like, for example, we went skiing on his birthday, and so he was pretty excited, which can also register as threat this past weekend. And he's in a good place right now, but everything I said, he would correct me. Like, remember when we went on this chairlift? No, Mom, it was this one. And it's like, if you correct it, it just continually escalates because it's a reflexive response. It's not like a rational response. So it can be verbal equalizing. It can be physical equalizing. It can be very subtle, like the correcting me on the ski slope, where it just seems like he's being a jerk. But if you push, it will escalate. The third thing is the constant need for nervous system signals of nervous system safety, or what it looks like to a parent is like they can't engage independently without you doing things for them or constantly giving them one-on-one attention. You can't talk to a co-parent. You can't do the dishes. You can't pay attention to someone else. Mama, mama, mama. And then if you don't pay attention to them, they start destroying things or like, breaking their brother's things or getting in their brother's face and saying like, you're stupid. I'm just using examples from my life. Fourth is, and I want to do a little asterisk on this one because sometimes with internalized expressions, not the internalized where it's not as much fight flight, it's more internalized and freeze. Those kids sometimes appear to be able to play alone more than the externalized. The fourth is high masking. Again, it's a distribution. So like some kids are more typically autistic and they don't mask socially, but masking is like appearing as two different versions of oneself. So I define it as internalizing the threat response, not just imitating neurotypical norms. And parents are like, well, if it's like, how can they do that if it's a survival response? But this would mean like, they're totally explosive at home, but then they're an angel at school or with their grandparents or the reverse, right? So it's like they can only really let out their fight flight when they subconsciously perceive safety. So often where their behavior is the worst is where they're the safest. And then the fifth is the fluctuating nature of the disability, which is like really that there's like an accumulation over time and then a tipping point rather than like every time there's X sound, they're going to scream, right? It's like it can be very unpredictable, like the walking on eggshells as parents. So those are the five.
Right.
I was quicker with
no, those are great.
The next four.
Do you think this is just something that just occurred to me? What do you think is masking a form of freeze?
I think so. I would define it as like a internalized pathway, of the nervous system response. Like they're still being activated at school, but it's going more into freeze. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it just kind of occurred to me. And do you talk about fawn much at all with PDA?
So fawn, it's interesting. So in the paradigm shift, my signature program, we have an alumni community, and this is actually like a debate ongoing in the community right now, which I think is so interesting because we have a lot of internalized PDA moms in there, sort of working through their own identity / internal experience, right? And so, and super intelligent. Like some of them were saying, you presented fawn more as a social strategy that precedes fight, flight, and then collapse, like freeze or collapse. But their perspective in the community was like, actually, I think it is more like collapse and more a sustained state, like as an internalized PDA. So I think that's the one of the four that I feel least adept at explaining, especially because in the work on trauma and polyvagal theory, it's not talked about as much. And I had always thought of it as like the social strategy, like your child may try and ingratiate themselves with you as the authority or person with power or a teacher in order to stay safe. And if that doesn't work, then they might move more into fight flight. And then the next level would be freeze and collapse. But I think it's an interesting question. I think Sally Cat, who's an internalized PDA, has some good writing on this. So
I'll check it out. It is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's a good question.
So if you, is it harder to get, like you mentioned before that, that a lot of that, because it's a disability, it's important to be able to access some supports or resources that you might not otherwise get without sort of an assessment, a diagnosis. And I'm not saying that I believe self-diagnosis is valid, but if you are trying to get a diagnosis so that you can access school supports or social supports or whatever, do you think PDA is less likely to be diagnosed as autistic than a non-PDA autism profile because of the differences?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think, again, there's a distribution here, but on average, I think what's disabling to these kids is not social communication differences as much as it is their nervous system response, their sort of trauma response to perceived threat. It accumulates in the body and it also interacts with their sensory experience.
Yeah.
Right. So, my son, you'd meet him, and if he was in a regulated place, you'd never think he was autistic.
Right.
And that's true for a lot of these kids.
Yeah. So that because
yeah.
the sort of more outdated view of what autism looks like focuses a lot on the social engagement. If that isn't present or as present, and then I think people tend to see it more like bad behavior.
Yeah. Lots of ODD diagnoses for sure. Lots of ADHD, like quote, severe ADHD. And, there's a lot of autism diagnoses that are then approached through more behavioral modification strategies or ABA, and then it really goes off the rails because those are essentially modalities that are just repeatedly activating.
It's the opposite, right?
System.
It's the opposite of what you'd want to do with somebody who's PDA, right? Making demands.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Can we shift a little bit and talk about what are some, actually one more question before we shift into strategies. How common is PDA? Do you know, or do you have a sense of that?
I have no idea, but I'm going to say something a little tongue in cheek. Like the fact that I have almost 100,000 followers indicates to me that is not rare.
Yeah.
Because I'm not that exciting. You know what I mean? Like, I think it reflects the fact that there's so much need for recognition and support for these families, but they've been put down pathways that are like sort of correct or have made things worse.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think it's very prevalent. I think it is something that we're just beginning to understand and explore in terms of research. And, a lot of what preceded the research and things going on now was very brave adult autistic PDA advocates talking about their lived experience to understand the root cause of what activates their nervous system.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. So can we talk a little bit about strategies that you find useful personally and that you recommend professionally for parents? I mean, I know you teach a lot about this, and one of the only one that I'm really super familiar with, which I know I've heard you say, I think it was on Debbie's podcast, was only one of the tools in your toolkit, which is low demand parenting. And Amanda Deepman was on my podcast talking about low demand. So I'm familiar with low demand, which is dropping, for people who aren't familiar, dropping demands when you have a PDA kid. I don't know if there's something more you want to say about that, or if there are some other things that you could share with us that you also have in your toolkit for helping families who have PDA kids.
Sure. So let's see. So can I throw some out there and you pick what we talk
Sure.
about?
Yeah.
Okay. So one thing I teach in my program, we have a whole module on it that precedes some of the accommodations, like lowering demands or declarative language or providing autonomy and equality, which is actually a decision-making framework, a cost-benefit decision-making framework based around the neurotype of PDA and like how to actually make decisions through a clear lens. And then I teach 12 accommodations and like troubleshoot it with parents. So, there's providing autonomy, equality, language accommodations, nervous system co-regulation, low demands, trauma-informed play, humor, de-escalation, diffusion, de-escalation, risk mitigation, then 2 more.
Okay. Before I choose one or two, do you mind talking a little bit more about the first thing that you said, that decision making?
Yeah. Okay. So I think, why don't we focus on that for now? Because I think it's like, if there's one thing, this is the hardest thing to learn, but it's the portal, I think, to parents' peace and freedom and the child's true transformation within the family and the family transformation, which is this basic truth that nobody wants to hear or accept, including myself, which is at any given point, no matter where you are, what you're doing with your child or where they are, there's only 2 choices. You're either activating or accommodating them. There's no in between. And so that can make us feel super constrained, right? Because every interaction, we're either accommodating or we're activating. And accommodating puts a lot of pressure on parents. It puts a lot of real trade-offs on parents. However, we can't change that that's our decision point, right? So once parents accept that, within constraints, they're making these decisions, it becomes a portal to transcending those constraints. And what do I mean by that? Most parents, whether they realize it or not, on a certain level, yes, they're like, yeah, my kid is PDA, I'm going to lower demands, but they can't talk to me like that. Or I need to have them play by themselves, or they have to go to school, right? Or like a diffusion example would be telling a lie, or, a child walking in the house and being like, get me Pirates booty, and you bringing them Pirates booty and they say, I said nachos, right? In that moment, I have a choice. I can try and teach them. I can try and be like, you can't talk to mommy like that. You're going to eat the Pirates booty because it's what you asked for. They could say, no, I didn't. And then you continue arguing. But every interaction is activating their nervous system. So what a parent has to do is choose, is it worth it to correct this lie or try and teach? Because they're actually in the part of their brain where they can't. You can do it all you want, but they're just going to go deeper into their nervous system activation. And that might mean they'll stop sleeping eventually, right? So we have to make these choices of like, I diffuse. I'm like, okay, honey, you want the nachos? Sure, here it is. And that's more than lowering demands, and that's more than gentle parenting. That's accommodating a threat response that I see as an indicator of what's going on inside his body. And if I choose to activate over and over by trying to teach in the moment or correct him or argue with him or escalate, it's going to have an impact on his basic needs. That's the calculation. And so sometimes, usually, it takes parents a whole program just to accept that one trade-off. And it's like you think you do because you keep fighting it against it of like, well, I can lower this demand, or, I'll play with them more, or, fine, I'll get their shoes on them. But like in those moments, a parent feels reactive, and like all the societal conditioning of like, you can't let your child talk to you like that. You're teaching them to be abusive, whatever it is, are all flooding into your brain, and you have to fight it. And it's a long-term approach. It's not going to fix it in the moment. It's like years of doing that is what establishes connection, trust, safety, and brings their nervous system down to a point where they can actually operate from the frontal lobe, access cognitive strategies, access gentle parenting, access collaborative problem solving or therapy, right? But we work through I spot coach parents of like, let's take a scenario and then we place the cost benefit within the family cost benefit too, which is different for every parent, right? So that precedes troubleshooting with accommodations or like perfecting how we lower demands, because it's really like the energetic shift. And this is what happens when parents finally accept that that's the trade-off, that's the decision, and see clearly the decision within their constraints of like, yeah, I'm going to set this boundary because I need my other child to stay safe, but it's going to result in a big meltdown with maybe a broken plate.
Right.
I'm still going to set the boundary, and it's accepting that of like, that's my choice.
Yeah.
Right. And it sucks.
Yeah.
It's like a very traumatic decision.
Yeah.
Calculation. Right.
That reminds me of, I mean, just the enormity of it. I mean, and I imagine that the parents that you coach or that in your community that can accept that you're either activating or accommodating, who actually really start to believe that in their heart, are the ones that go on and have, quote, success in making things better and easier in their family. And if they can't accept that, then they're stuck. Right. And I mean, success, like they're making progress. It kind of reminds me of in peaceful parenting, if I'm working with families and they don't really truly believe that a kid wants to be good, they're never going to be able to use the strategies, right? If part of them still believes like, oh, they're doing this on purpose, or they're, trying to get me or whatever. It's kind of like you have to believe at like a cellular level in the basic premise that you're talking about.
Yes. The like inside and behind all of this, for some parents, violence is this, innate good being that is obscured by this fight flight response. And it's really hard to believe. And it took me a huge leap of faith and being like pretty atheist to like being a Buddhist or like Buddhist practices to make this leap myself, because I was just like, I couldn't see it. I couldn't see the quote goodness. But again, it's a choice to trust that. And this is where, I think actually all parents make progress, because even when they're stuck, even having an awareness, right? Like the first step is just like, yes, this is a thing, right? And then there's language, and then it makes sense. And then you don't feel like such a bad parent. And then we move on to the acceptance, and it's really a process. So, but yeah, I will say some of the most profound shifts that I've seen for families have been when the parent does make that, like it's almost like rock bottom, or like it feels like giving up, of just like, okay, this is my life. This is what it is. I can't change it. And then things paradoxically really start to turn around.
Yeah, no, I believe it. I believe you in that. Before we started recording, I had office hours for my membership, and I told them that I was going to be interviewing you. And one of my members asked me to ask you this question, which is, what
Okay, let's see.
what do you do if you have one sibling who's not PDA and the other one who is, and you're always having to, the example that you gave, I want pirate booty. No, I said nachos, and you, how do you explain isn't exactly the right word, but how do you navigate having two different neurotype kids where one of them sees that the other one's always getting their demands given into, or however you want to look at it like that? And do you do the same for both kids, or is there some way that you navigate that?
Yeah, so how I help parents navigate this question, I'll say just like the first thing I would do with this mom would be like, okay, she would get on the call with me and we'd be like, what are your constraints? What are your financial constraints? What's your neurotype? Do you have childhood trauma? Is your partner around? Like, because all the quote solutions are going to come from us first making decisions within those constraints, right? So it's going to be unique to the parent, but I can tell you what I do in my family, which is not necessarily like, I don't recommend parents do things. I give them things to experiment with, and I give them tools to make decisions. Okay. So I often hesitate to be like, this is what I do, because then it's like, well, I'm a single parent and I can't do that, or I don't have your finances. And it's really
All right, we'll take
just
it
an
with a grain of
illustration.
salt.
Yeah, take it with a grain of salt. But I would say for the last 3 years, one of the biggest decisions I made through this decision-making framework was that we needed to split the kids and needed to allocate finances and energy and decision-making towards that, because it wasn't safe. And I could see that my younger son was being traumatized, right? And so for the last 3 years, with the last 6 months being a little bit of an exception, we've spent Christmases apart. We've spent vacations apart. We've spent everything, every weekend apart, right? Where one parent is on each kid. So there's one-on-one undivided attention, so that there's nervous system signals of safety for Cooper. We also got an au pair 3 years ago who we trained to play one-on-one, right? I think in terms of accommodating, like, I use a lot of the same approaches with my younger son, who's 5. I deliver him food on the couch while he watches an iPad. It's not my preference. Like, I really wish we would sit down and have family dinners without screens and that they would be full of organic greens. Of course, that's how I eat. But like, that's the trade-off right now at this stage of my life of, keeping things equal or fair. But within that, I do have different cost benefit decisions around William, the younger one, of like, no, you don't get to watch the same things as your brother. And yes, you do have some limits around screens. I don't necessarily just like take it away from him for a consequence, but I say, like, we're going to play now. Or with his food, like, he eats vegetables and fruit, and my PDA son does not, right? So I think a lot of the accommodations are the same. I try and put in like undivided attention and play with my younger son, like I did with my older son. I try and lower demands if he needs it. We do lots of sensory stuff, but the cost benefit decision around his needs is different. I do have different boundaries and limits and expectations for him. And yeah, it activates him sometimes. But we've sort of found a balance. And as my older son's nervous system activation has come down over years, it's now safer for us to have the kids together sometimes.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about, this is, I think, one of my last questions. I've been so great answering so many questions. What about when, like, when you gave the example of the, I want pirate booty, I want nachos. Um, what about when kids like that, to me personally, would be a lot easier to see in a younger child than in an older child? Just
Mm-hmm.
because I can't help it, but my expectations, I mean, I can try to
Yeah,
acknowledge it,
of
but my
course.
expectations raise as kids get older in terms of their behavior and how they treat other people. And like fast forwarding into adulthood, do you have a sense of like how PDA adults manage this in terms of like their interpersonal relationships?
I think that would be a good question for someone who is PDA.
Okay.
But I can tell you, like, I work with a lot of PDA, mostly internalized expressions, a lot of PDA women. So I do think it's a different question when someone internalizes their stress response than equalizes against another.
Mhm. Because
Um,
I just want to fill out the question a little bit more because I think you understand, but somebody else may not have understood.
yeah, what's
I
going to happen when they're older
Yeah, I always coach
if we
parents
keep
of like,
doing this?
don't take it
Totally.
personally. You're not equals. Like if your kid's behavior towards you is not abuse, even if it feels like it, because you're not in a relationship of equals. But then what if you are? I guess is my question. And it's fine if
Yeah.
you
So
say you're not
again,
the person to answer it, and I can, ask somebody
no,
else.
I can answer that question. So, like, here's my perspective on this, and it has been corroborated by my experience with my son and many of the people I've worked with, however not all, right? And so just like you and I were talking about, like, I have had clients who have worked consistently through an accommodation lens who at the end of that consistency saw this isn't going to work for my family, and we're actually going to go more into behavioral strategies, and that's their choice. I always believe that the parent has good intentions and knows their kid better than I do, right? Or, you know, I know a family who did super low demand, lots of screen times, all the stuff you're supposed to do when a kid's in burnout for 2 years. And then it seemed like the kid was really depressed, potentially suicidal, and addicted to screens. And so she made a very different decision about what to do there. But what I generally see is that when we start to focus our accommodations on the survival part of the brain, right? Of like, okay, in the moment, like he's literally just equalizing. Maybe he had a hard day at school, and maybe he's going to do this when he's 18 or 17. And I'm still going to accommodate it. Like, I'm just saying that because I believe it's a disability, right? But what I have seen is that the more we've accommodated over time, the less that behavior is a baseline and the more it's an exception, right? So, as I said, my son was equalizing verbally on the ski hill, right? Correcting me. It was easy to let it go because he wasn't throwing things at me. He wasn't like calling me stupid or names, but he used to, right? But in that moment, it's just like, okay, he's super activated. He's excited. I'm his safest. Well, actually, dad's kind of his safest person now. I'm his second safest person. And this is the indicator, right, of that. Um, so, I made a decision like for as long as he needs me to deliver him food, if that's what helps him eat, I'm going to do it because I have a kid with a disability and it doesn't necessarily go away when they're an adult. And like, that's what I mean by radical acceptance. But when I did that, I completely let go of control and it shifted my energy with him where like truly, I wasn't trying to get him to get his own food. But guess what? He does it sometimes now, right? And like the more we can get them to get out of the survival brain, strengthen neural pathways back to the frontal lobe, the more they can actually cognitively be aware of themselves and are modeling and make good decisions and learn, right? But like kids don't learn and teenagers don't learn and adults don't learn if they're spending all their time in the amygdala. And so it's deeply counterintuitive. It requires a lot of radical acceptance. I believe for many PDA kids this is the best approach. It's the approach I use in my family. Um But again, it's an empirical question. Like, I also teach parents how to track indicators of like basic needs access, connection, and nervous system activation. So we actually look for indicators over the 3 months of my program of like, are they eating better? Or are they eating worse? Like, if they have toileting issues, maybe they're peeing all over the house, but like now the incremental indicator is that they're peeing near the bathroom. Then maybe at the end of the program, they're still peeing in the bathtub, but not all over the house, and they let their mom in, right? So it's like this very long-term incremental approach that's based on the nervous system and the root cause of what's putting them in their survival brain.
That makes sense. Thank you. Oh, no.
Yeah. I mean, that's like the primary question that I get on
Is
social
it?
media of like, yeah, I mean, because everything in our lives, whether it's educational, medical, parenting, working in a corporate environment like I used to, everything is cause and effect and consequences and rewards and sanctions, right? Like, you work hard, you get more money, or you get a raise, you do what the boss says, like you get promoted. I mean, I think we're all deeply conditioned to think that the best way to parent is through rewards and sanctions and to teach. And I think for parents of PDA kids, sometimes our job is to like steward another human, and we don't have a lot of control over it other than providing felt safety.
Well, I think that applies. I mean, that
And
I believe that too, and I'm not a PDA person.
yeah, yeah. But also the caregiving aspect of
Yeah.
like, it's not just parenting, it's caregiving.
Mhm.
And you might have to do it for more than 3 years. You know, you might have to do it when they're 18. I
Yeah.
mean, these kids are autistic, they have sensory issues, some of them have a lot of other things going on. So it's not just like, do this approach and then everything will be well.
Right.
It's like a big part of the approach is like redefining your identity as raising a child with a disability
Yeah, that's just what I
and
was
what that
thinking of.
means.
Yeah, and it's a
Yeah.
lifelong. Disabilities don't go away at the end of childhood.
Yeah, but they fluctuate with this one, which is what makes it so confusing.
Yeah. Well, I thank you so much. I'm just going to ask you my last question, which is what I ask all my podcast guests, which is if
Yeah.
you could go back in time to your new parent self, what advice would you give
Mm.
yourself? It could be to do with anything.
Oh, man. Move back to Michigan earlier and don't worry about your career because you're going to need a lot more help than you thought. No, that would have been too triggering for my new mom self. I think just like maybe like your life is going to look so much different than you thought it would. And this is the birth of this child is going to change everything about it, but it's actually going to turn out in a way that's healing and that you never expected. So trust your intuition and lean into the hard and the grief, and like, you will come out on the other side.
Thank you.
And there's good stuff there on the other side. It's just going to take time.
Yeah. Where's the best place for folks to go and find out more about you and what you do?
Yeah, so I think I'm most active on Instagram, at Peace Parents. There's also a website where you can see we have 2 coaches. I'm a coach too, but I have a very long wait list. So they can go to www.atpeaceparents.com. I'm also on YouTube, TikTok. I have a podcast at Peace Parents.
Great.
And you can always email our admin team at journey@peaceparents.com. So we have people who will respond, even if it's not me.
Okay. Well, we'll put all those links in our show notes. And thank you so much, Casey, for coming on.
Yeah, it was super fun. Thanks for having me.